will be taken into consideration. Okay, so without further ado, I call ourselves to order. Let's get the Prime Minister. Here.
Okay, hello. How's the volume?
Loud and clear.
All right. A few seconds to get my timer. POIs in chat, please. And okay, we'll start. 5, 4, 3, 2. Many well-meaning men think that women need to be protected, that they need to be saved. But women don't need to be saved. They need to be granted the agency to empower themselves on their own terms, which can never happen when we view them as others, as someone who are different from men and another kind of human, right? So where does this policy happen? Probably not in Afghanistan or places where the worst abuses happen, because the concept of benevolent sexism is only a relevant and salient concept in places where the worst abuses against women are gone, or at the very least, there's a broad conception and consensus among society that these are bad. We say for two reasons. One, that the movement is strategic. It is primarily composed of women, and therefore they know in which areas it is more problematic. So maybe in more liberal areas like San Francisco, this is a bigger, benevolent sexism is a bigger issue. But in more rural areas where domestic abuse is still an extremely large problem, that's where they would focus more on hostile sexism. So obviously, this does not mean all of our capacities and resources will be our benevolent sexism. It's clearly a balance based on what the movement thinks is best. And obviously, too, that there are call-out mechanisms within these feminist movements for prioritization in all countries that are past the third wave. So significant means we'll always have to take away some time and attention away from hostile sexism, but we can still be targeted of location and context. Now, how do we combat this problem? We say this is not about tactics. It's not about cancel culture or more positive, empowering narrative. These both can exist depending on what the movement wants. But we say these combating refers to saying women are complex individuals and you cannot put them into boxes. That women belong in the workforce. They can take care of themselves. And therefore, we need to stop thinking of them as other people who we assign stereotypes to. We see the analysis here is that the feminine movement is smart. They know that benevolent sexism is not experienced on the same wavelength as hostile sexism. And therefore, the attitude of the feminist movement against benevolence are clearly more moderate. So we will still be able to recognize our priorities, even if we're giving significant attention. Two arguments. One, how their side denies women the agency that they need in their attempt to help them. And two, how this helps the women themselves realize their oppressive structures. First one, agency. Let's explain what these positive connotations are. They generally link to the idea that women need to be protected. They are emotionally sensitive. They have specific roles in society only in the house and not in other places. All of these mean women are deemed as weak, and therefore any attempt to protect women on their side means you have to believe that women have less of a capacity to make choices for themselves given their weaker position in society, which means one, any policies that aim to help them will not be based on what is truly good for them, but what men think is good for them, right? Such as banning the burqa or banning sex work, where women can sometimes make a legitimate choice that is the best option for them, even if it's not perfect. Their side would talk about things like manufactured consent, saying these women don't know what they want because they view them as needing to be protected and more emotionally sensitive. And therefore, even if these women like the burqa, or maybe the burqa allows them to make specific negotiations within their household, allowing them to leave the house, whereas not wearing a burqa would mean they would be banned from leaving the house, means that they would deny these people the very agency they need to make the best decisions for themselves. These women are the only people who know what is best for them. They deny them the opportunity to speak up for themselves. But two, we say it limits the roles women can take in society because it's rooted in an underlying conception that women have certain traits that are essentialized towards being a woman. Therefore, you would not view women to be leaders because political leaders, for example, or CEOs have traits that are not deemed feminine, such as strength or decisiveness, which are fundamentally at odds with the traits such as caring or being emotionally sensitive. And therefore, they will forever be locked into caretaker roles, into sidekick, secretariat roles, where they will never be able to make broad change in society. We need women in power and women in other roles to be able to enact pro-women policies because only they understand what they experience and they will be able to put policies that benefit women as a whole. But also they are role models that allow more individuals to break glass ceilings and be in the different career paths they weren't able to before. So we'd say their side is the reason why there are few women in STEM because women are never told that they have other options. They never believe because no one tells them that they're able to be other things aside from what society tells them to. But lastly, it reinforces toxic masculinity. The idea that women are more emotionally sensitive and other narratives like this are simply an excuse to offload this work onto women away from men. Because if women are more emotionally sensitive naturally, it means men don't have to consider them feelings. It means men box up their feelings and only release them in a violent manner that is against the women interest of women, right? Emotional labor that we always give to women instead of men. These lessen the agency and their individual interactions with men because men always feel like they can offload more work onto women, the point at which they view women as fundamentally different from them. In conclusion, we say agency is important because people are smart and know what's best for themselves, such as sex work. And therefore, the policies they want, though well-meaning, are not what are best for the women and therefore do not actually benefit the most vulnerable women on their side of the house. Second argument, for the women themselves. We say this narrative is subversive. Why? We say these problems are not attributed to traits of toxic cis men and therefore are often wrapped up in notions of glorification. The idea that a chivalrous man is a very good man. So they are hardly called out in society because the problem is invisibilized because these are even viewed as positive characteristics. And therefore, no one else but the feminist movement has the scale, authority, and agency to pierce through the veil of this type of sexism, because it's relatively easy for men to realize that hostile sexism is bad. There's very few people who will openly admit that domestic abuse is something they like. But the ideas of benevolent sexism are insidious and extremely hard to recognize, where it's only a woman who would be able to find that these problems exist. And therefore, there's an incredible incentive and need for us to explain that it is a problem. Otherwise, people wouldn't notice it. POI, yeah.
Yeah, so you claim just now that all you need to do is to say women are complex individuals. You now tell me this is subversive and insidious and difficult to call out. How do you intend to successfully combat these narratives of benevolent sexism?
We can give emotionally charged language that people can understand, such as saying that, well, maybe women shouldn't fit into stereotypes, right? We say it is an insidious narrative, and we have called out insidious narratives in the past. Okay, so even if there's minimal change to the conservative parts of society, we can identify vast swaths of allies who are unexposed to the ways that well-meaningness translates to sexism, right? Because a large amount of progressive sympathizers are also men, still tolerate the power structures within these sexist narratives because it's kind of hard to grasp. So we say benevolent sexism as well is a gateway to holding worse sexist beliefs under the pretense of being a savior, and therefore not combating this problem early leads to worse and worse opinions upon which they are never called out in the future. So what is the impact then? There's lots of learned helplessness among women who are not able to realize this is a problem because they weren't told there was a problem. And therefore, and they didn't realize it was a problem. So we're able to break through that in their personal interaction. They're now able to realize, oh, maybe my husband should do more work around the house and negotiate on that level. Or maybe my boss shouldn't tell me these compliments to how I am very cute or attractive, which are actually bad. And they're best able to call out these for their personal sake. But also that any social change requires that women themselves know what the problem is and they're able to fight for these and rally for these on our side of the house. So we say the way is that it's far more important to have this change than the marginal added benefit of running a few more ads against hostile sexism, which has been a hot topic for the last 50 years. And therefore, we get more change and more relevant change on our side of the house. Lastly, we say that the extension of closing government is very derivative of ours and you can't credit it. And that's why we beat CG. Thank you.
All right, I thank the Prime Minister for that speech and call the next speaker, Leader of Opposition. Here.
Cool.
and call the next speaker, Deputy Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay. Let me just find my timer. There it is. Eight, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So Elo said a lot of things, but when you actually look at what he said, he forwarded like one argument on how it splits the movement, and then he spent the rest of his time impacting on how hostile sexism is a lot worse than benevolent sexism. We don't actually contest that. We actually just weigh it out on 3 levels that he didn't respond to. And when Sean does, it's kind of like backloading because we said all of this at PM. The first thing we told you is that we immediately weighed out the problem. Elo's call out is unfounded. We first gave you several reasonable reasons as to why the feminist movement would default to combating hostile sexism. First was for the reasons Elo themselves say. Hostile sexism is clearly more visceral and harmful to women, both on a physical and emotional aspect. And therefore, the feminist movement, which is primarily comprised of women, are likely to take this into account and have been doing so for the last 50 years. The second thing we told you is that because the women lead the movement, the women follow the movement, clearly if the movement splits and fragments upon these lines, people are likely to reevaluate and consider the effects of actually spending a significant amount of time and resources and probably spend less. We told you that significant does not mean the majority of resources. It could be 20 or 30%, but that would still be a significant minority of resources that are currently not being mobilized now. And the third thing is we told you is the call out mechanism of the feminist movement, which allow them to self-regulate. We got one response to this, and that's to say, but benevolent sexism is more prevalent in India. Yes, but on the comparative sliding scale, clearly a lot of things are more prevalent in conservative societies. And in that instance, we are probably not going to do that. And I think it's more reasonable for an average reasonable person to believe if benevolent sexism is a lot more problematic in conservative areas, hostile sexism is way, way more problematic, and therefore the balance of resources is likely not to be there. The second weighing mechanism we told you is that clearly there are 2 more views to this. The first thing we told you is that women have been combating hostile sexism for 50 years, as identified by PEP and as identified in the POI from Tobi. We told you from 3 things. The first is combating domestic violence. The second is the campaign against marital assault and proving that people who are in marriages can still be abused and exploited by their parents. And the third is the suffragettes campaigning for the right to vote. There is a whole host of ways women have been combating the hostile sexism, which means that the people in society already know it exists. Women understand to avoid it. And the only people that will not adjust are the people who are already on the far right and who truly don't care about women, which means that it is unlikely that our marginal delta of additional campaigns in these areas are likely to change them. At best, they can say, but we can still use these funding for shelters, etc. But we told you that these shelters are not underfunded in society today. The vast majority of governments already fund them, which means that even if we do concede that we do lose the marginal amount of funding, we told you that that amount of funding is going to be far better off attacking a problem that is currently not identified in society today. The third level of weighing we tell you, just so we don't get shafted by closing, is that benevolent sexism actually solves their problems, which means that in the short term, we might have more problems of hostile sexism because of a stopgap mechanism of us spending more resources on us. But in the long term, we actually solve a lot of the problems of hostile sexism. Again, unresponded to. Sean is going to backload if he responds to this. We told you, and we said specifically that the reason why hostile sexism occurs was because of benevolent sexism in the first place. Because men are not born and are not conditioned to be evil right out of the womb. Sexism is a long road from firstly believing that you were doing the best for women and then controlling the women in your power dynamics with them and then infantilizing them and teaching them to believe that they cannot survive without you, and then evolving into patterns of household and domestic abuse, in which at that point, because a woman is so conditioned to staying with you, to believing that they are attached to you, they can no longer do things like seek for help for the same things that you were funding on opposition side, which means that these are corollary things that you have to do at the same time, because women's shelters and abortion clinics do not matter if these women are already conditioned to believe that the man is doing everything they can for the family and therefore should always be listened to at the very end of the day, which means that we have to do this at the same time for first and world developing countries with these resources already, because this is a justification men use in households, and it's a justification men tell themselves to attempt to show themselves that they are good people. Clearly, if they are the moderates and are right-leaning who are not that bad already, they are going to justify it. And if we are able to break that myth early with people who are like 18, 20, 25 years old and people who are still able to listen, then we will reduce the amounts of harmful sexism in the future, and therefore we are able to get the benefits. The second issue I want to ask is Sean's POI. He says, is it insidious or easy to call out? So I just want to do it now. One, that's a false dichotomy. There is a broad range of insidious narratives that are easy to identify and charge. Like, for example, racism. You can call out people when they are being racist. But if you don't identify it in the first place, it's very, very hard to realize that, because you were not taught from a young age that racism is actually just as basic as not liking the way someone else looks or sounds. But the problem is when it lies below the level of rational thought, it's hard to identify yourself, which is why we told you from PEP, it's easy to call out people for benevolent sexism, but it's hard for you to call yourself out and identify it yourself through current societal narratives. The first thing we told you is through empowerment. We first have to empower women and tell them that they belong in the workplace, that they belong and are able and are seen to be able to take equal places in domestic society, and therefore able to pressure their husband to take on more work. And the reason why the husband will listen was because the woman also herself volunteers to take on more professional work, which allows people to benefit from them and are able to help support the family. So the man might say, okay, I might be a bit emasculated because I take a bit more on domestic work, but at least my wife is now taking on more work in the workplace, and therefore it's a lot better for me. But the second thing we told you is that identifying instances of benevolent sexism are likely to happen in a well-conduced manner. We gave you 3 reasons why. The first thing we told you is about the spectrum of problematic behavior. We told you that on benevolent sexism, moderate and well-meaning behavior means that women understand that this is far lower on the rung of hostile sexism. So it's far easier to engage with men on a level of rationality, and therefore it's likely for more conducive conversations to be had that are far less vitriolic and therefore hurt men less, because you have an honest conversation about how the well-meaningness of the loved one in your life is hurting you directly. But secondly, it also overlaps with important and empowering narratives that women already themselves want to forward. So even if we don't solve the benevolent sexism, this is still an empowering narrative. Like, for example, women that belong in the workplace, or that women and men ought to have equal housework decision work, means that our impacts still fly, even if you don't believe that society is going to change rapidly. But the third thing we told you is that people are going to listen. Why is this so? Because before you go all the way into the spectrum of hostile sexism, past the point of no return, you still must believe in yourself, and you must believe that you are truly well-meaning for women. If you believe that you are truly well-meaning for women, if your wife themselves or other women in your community call you out for not actually being well-meaning, then it breaks that spectrum and it breaks that insidious narrative that you yourself believe in, and you realize, wait, if the women in my life are not actually believe that I am well-meaning, then probably I'm doing the wrong things. And that is the important mechanism as to why people are more likely to be swayed right before they hit hostile sexism. In short, this is a huge problem. Hostile sexism is already being combated. We're not taking away from that. At worst, it's marginal. But thirdly, we also prevent hostile sexism in the future. And this is the way forward for post-third wave societies.
I thank the DPM for that speech and call the next speaker, Diallo. Here.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
Cool, thanks. Right, sorry, one moment. Right, starting in 3, 2, 1. So the only thing I agree with from the OG is that the CG is going to be derivative. I don't know why they figured this out, but sure. The first thing I want to talk about is what the debate is, and therefore what it means to commit significantly, right? Because the reality is that if there are 2 issues in the world, hostile sexism and benevolent sexism, you want to focus on one. What's likely to happen is exactly what has happened in the status quo, i.e., you see, for example, people saying, I don't want to talk about like these extreme forms of racism, because that's not what matters. Those are isolated instances. I want to talk about lower level forms of racism and microaggression instead. That kind of explicit shift is necessary in order to achieve the outcomes that they want, which is for people to no longer focus on hostile sexism, but on benevolent sexism. That's why I think the burden that they take on is quite significant in making this particular trade-off. I also think that like significant is not majority. I mean, come on, like if it's not, I don't like, cannot be, right? Significant by definition means most that fuck me, it's just a lot, like, right? It must be a lot of time spent on that side of the house. They cannot dodge the burden in DPM. First, how do we fight hostile sexism? The claim from that side is hostile sexism doesn't exist in the context you want to talk about, because this debate exists in San Fran and New York. Couple of things. The first is that this ignores the frame that's set out in Isaac, which was to suggest that sexism was inherent to the way in which our society functions. Even in the most liberal areas, it is inherent in the fact that people are still tend to be religious. It is inherent in the fact that people are brought up believing in this sexism. It is inherent in the fact that it appears to be confirmed by things like biology, which means that even in these liberal areas, I would posit that what happens is that people have to a significant degree accepted that these are wrong, but it does not mean that these base instincts shift fundamentally. At the point that you keep calling them out, therefore, and like that means that the inherent sexism, which has manifested itself into fairly benevolent forms of sexism, now manifests itself into more sexist forms of hostile forms of sexism, as I'll talk about later. But the first thing to note, therefore, is that sexism is inherent and can always shift into hostile sexism. The second thing to note is that they can't actually bifurcate the world. Number one, if they want to situate this debate in San Fran, in New York, the impacts of OG are going to be absolutely marginal on that side of the house, because a lot of other things check the extent to which benevolent sexism manifests in negative, tangible outcomes for women already. But second and more pertinently, platforms are global. If Taylor Swift says that she wants to focus on benevolent sexism because hostile sexism is not really the issue, that is something that the world takes lead from, because her influence and the influence of these feminist icons transcends national borders and borders of the extent of like feminism. What that means in turn is that you shift the goalpost for feminism writ large on that side of the house. That is material from Isaac that hasn't been dealt with. The response to this is, we tried already and it failed. Couple of responses. The first is that this created gains in shifting people out of hostile sexism from that previous effort of trying, right? The problem is that they assume that social progress is linear, but it really isn't. For example, we thought that we had achieved abortion rights. We got like the movement writ large got complacent, pushed for other things, realized that we hadn't actually convinced a large majority of people that fetuses were not human beings. The implication of this is that if social progress is not linear, there's always a risk of reversal, which OG refuses to deal with. But secondly, note that presumably this also exists in a lot more subtle ways that they don't deal with, right? Things like women, like the women bed that Jan put in the motion clarification also refers to things like women lie, women can't deal with pleasure. These are hostile stereotypes that they talk about that ultimately result in the same bad outcomes for women, and they are equally insidious and hard to call out on that side of the house. But finally, what Isaac tells us is, if we want institutional change, we need a significant degree of resources in order to achieve these particular forms of change. The conclusion at this point, therefore, is if you believe that hostile sexism still exists, then you need to believe that this is a problem given the weighing in Isaac that they don't deal with. But second and more pertinently, why does the capacity to change this get worse? The first thing I want to note is that the belated attempt to prove mechanism in DPM is just fundamentally bizarre. They claim that the difference is there is going to be self-interest, right? We're going to tell you that you benefit from economics. This exists everywhere, that you would tangibly get more money in a world where women went out to work. Clearly, that is insufficient. And that speaks to the core problem, that the more they wanted to call it insidious, the more they wanted to say we're just going to use emotionally charged language, that won't actually create change. At that point, the arguments from outside of the house become particularly pertinent in telling you why they're going to drive people away. One, because you actively call out allies, you are likely to get women, in their best case, by the way, extremely angry about the extent of injustice that they suffer. Therefore, you are likely to embolden them to call out in more and more toxic ways that drives men away from this particular movement, or makes them feel like they're unwelcome as allies. But secondly, you lose the extent of tangibility that exists to focus these movements around, to convince people that this matters, because what you want are very intangible issues where moderates are not likely to support your movement. Again, the shift in focus, the suggestion that this is what you need to focus on, means that people are less likely to prioritize that in believing that this is particularly important, which in turn means that you are going to lose the degree of political capital that you have. The final thing they say is that benevolence turns to hostility, lends itself to hostility. First, I want to note that this is false because it takes a lot less women effort to speak to women than men. So this argument of learners' helplessness doesn't make sense, because you don't need the majority of the movement, because women are already likely to be keyed into what the movement is talking about. The same does not exist on that side. But secondly, benevolence on that side fundamentally involves calling out people who are who cross the line of benevolence. That is a way in which benevolence stops hostile sexism, a world where people don't buy into the feminist movement writ large or feel caught out and therefore no longer believe to the same extent in these philosophies. It's a world that is worse on that side of the house. CG, I'll take you if anything. Fine opening.
Isolating
You-
women is an assertion from both of your speakers versus our multiple structural reasons as to why the movement would be moderate in its approach to both men and women on the scale of harm, on the type of discourse, and how it's going to materialize at home, on the want for the feminist movement to not fragment, and on the desire for people to empower themselves rather than call other people.
First, you've had 15 seconds. Second, that's just not a POI. My speech has dealt with all of that. Second, what is the trade-off in this debate? There are two things to note that aren't responded to by the opening government. The first is that benevolent sexism actually leaves women significantly more agency. The reason for this is twofold. The first is that insofar as you want to claim benevolence, that requires you to at least listen to women, because you are claiming that women are people who have rights and who have therefore should be equally entitled to things like freedom of speech. That means that even if the broad frameworks are sexist, those frameworks are more open to negotiation than the comparative world of where hostile sexism is able to gain ground on that side of the house. But secondly, women are able to challenge this in a lot more insidious ways, in ways that are not as obvious, and that therefore benefit women without men realizing it, because men are in a benevolent sexist concept are not as on guard against women breaking norms, or don't feel like they're in a position to be as where they need to be as aggressive towards women. Secondly, we told you about how the scale of harm is significantly smaller as well in ISAC. But here's the comparative, right? Their claim is that in the long run, we'll solve it. But the short term of hostile sexism is really bad for two reasons. One, it encourages active harm that aims to shut women up, that is more aggressive towards women and tries to lock women out of this discourse. But secondly, hostile sexism, because it's easy to buy into, in that, like incels, for example, or like men who, or like more center-right men, I find it easy to buy into these narratives. If they, at the point that these men are convinced, that makes it harder for you to eventually push them towards benevolent sexism, because the extent to which you need to convince them is a lot further along the spectrum of sexism than in the status quo. That is why the status quo, where we try to push out against the worst form of sexism while trading off the existence of benevolent sexism, is significantly better on opening up.
All right, I thank the DLO for that speech and call the next speaker, member of government. Here.
Hello? Can I be seen and heard?
Yep, loud and clear.
Sean, your camera is still on. You might do something incriminating. Okay, great. POIs in the chat, please. 3, 2, 1. I will answer the base question of the motion that opening doesn't. Why does it need to be a significant amount of resources? I'm going to prove why that particular clause in the motion is relevant, and clearly I would suggest that this is not derivative. 4 things in the speech. First, why do we need to actively dedicate the amount of resources that we do? Second, why will we be successful at combating this narrative? Third, why this naturally excludes vulnerable women? And lastly, how this makes the propensity of hostile sexism much higher, directly engaging with the goal of opening opposition. Before I move on to that, I want to first ask and deal with the case coming from OO that simply says we need to combat hostile sexism. Obviously agree, but take a look at what LO says. They say that galvanizing the public against things like hostile sexism is much easier because empirically people are simply averse to things like violence and obvious discrimination. If this is true, presumably then the feminist movements need to allocate less resources to get a high level of impact that they want. It's unclear, for example, why you need to put all of the resources in that sense. It also assumes that there are probably actors separate from the feminist movement that are willing to give resources to the causes of hostile discrimination. This looks like children's rights groups, for example, in the case of domestic violence, wanting to be able to crack down on these things that are separate from the resources of the feminist movement. This means the hostile sexism that they want to combat is also recently combated on side closing government. First question, why do we need to actively dedicate resources to combating benevolent sexism? Note this is crucially missing from the top half and is the necessary link to explain why the feminist movement needs to dedicate a lot of capital to this. First, benevolent sexism is likely to become the dominant form of narrative for a few reasons. First, it already appeals to patriarchal standards, so people are likely to accept it. Second, there are current institutions that support its proliferation, like, for example, leave being given exclusive to women and wives and mothers rather than fathers. And third, privileged women are the ones who benefit the most from it, are unlikely to question it in the absent the movement. The impact, I think all of these mechanisms would suggest that the idea of benevolent sexism is likely to become the dominant narrative that influences women. What is the impact of it being dominant? First, it means that even if OO is correct, that it combats hostile sexism significantly, it makes it replaced with a massive, unquestionable structure later on in the timeline that is much more difficult to oppose. On opposition world, you either accept the benevolent sexism or you will be judged for it. Notice, again, for the fact that they play it up to become such a massive institution, it is far harder to question the ideas and the basis for all of this benevolent sexism later on in the timeline. Second, it makes it far more difficult to call it out in general because of its reach and power. And third, it makes it easier to blur the line between benevolent and hostile sexism, since there's little push to question the origins of the sexism that you experience, because both of these things originate from the same place. This piece of framing suggests that it is necessary to allocate significant resources because there is the pressing threat of it becoming dominant. We think we combat that coming from closing government. Second question then, why will we be successful at combating this narrative? And this is the mechanisms that OG was not willing to engage with. I want to make very clear, I think it's too high of a burden for opposition to push that we need to prove why we will overturn the ideas of benevolent sexism entirely. Presumably we can't do this on either side of the debate. The type of change then we get is simply to provide more space in the discussion of the validity of this narrative. How does this happen? Two mechanisms. First, we would suggest that the allocation of far more resources in itself makes it more likely that we place it in the consciousness of people, seeing it being questioned on TV or in social media, exposing individual to the questioning of these narratives in itself. We inform outsiders, for example, that sexism can manifest in seemingly positive ways, and they have to question their underlying assumptions about women rather than just their behavior. That's the first mechanism. The second mechanism is there are women who already feel limited by benevolent sexism because it prevents them from doing things they themselves might value, like economic independence or being able to be untethered to a family to pursue your own passions. This is particularly true in more conservative countries where does not currently exist a lot of infrastructure for the alternatives that women want to get. We would then suggest that there's an untapped significant masses of support for these types of opposition towards benevolent sexism. These are two mechanisms that I think makes it such that success is quite likely. The impact here is we do get the active questioning from women themselves and at least question the authority of all narratives placed on women. We would suggest that the delta that it suggests is actually quite good. The third thing that I want to ask is, and this is what I'm going to prove, is that it naturally excludes vulnerable women and creates hierarchies. The context here is, as we prove in our framing, not engaging in the narrative and expectations of dominant sexism, which makes it such that you are punished if you do not conform. The thing is, there are women who simply cannot conform to benevolent sexism. A few examples. First, women who subscribe to sexual liberation, women who want abortions or work in sex work. Second, women who want economic independence, just not deciding to be a wife. There's a social expectation, for example, for you to accept the instances of benevolent sexism. People question if what you want is actually good for you, and it gives a justification for question women's agency. But third, women who are just non-conformant to gender identities, trans women, LGBT women, for example, who do not want to be wives, nor do they want to have families. A few impacts to this argument then. These are genuinely important things that women want. They want rights over their bodies, to be able to choose to get an abortion. We want trans women's identities to be validated. That is inherently invalidated by benevolent sexism. It also kills any intersectional momentum the movement has by dividing us along lines of who fits gender stereotypes and who doesn't. I'd like to take a POI from opening.
Your attempt to sidestep the hostile debate is to say, but LO said that people care. There's a difference between fixing the effects of this, which provide immediate relief, versus the root causes and the root causes you suggested that you don't actually deal with.
So I agree, but it's unclear, for example, why you, like in the manner, for example, that the feminist movement tries to like combat these things are also likely to fix the roots. If you look at the current status quo, a lot of the instances in the status quo, despite, for example, all of the push against things like hostile feminism, it is the effects that are being mitigated, not necessarily the causes. But I would also suggest that the alternatives I give, specifically individuals who support things like children's rights, probably also want to take a look at the sources of these things and probably also try to combat those things as well. I would suggest it's not exclusive. Last thing, how this makes the propensity of hostile sexism much higher, directly engaging with the goal of opening opposition. Benevolent and malevolent sexism come from the same underlying assumptions that women should in some way be indebted to men, or their inherent attributes exclusive to men and women and the relationship between them, and it creates power asymmetries. Once you've invited benevolent sexism, men you interact with are more likely to believe that you're obligated to them, which invites harassment. Supporting benevolent sexism gives them a moral license to be sexist in other more malevolent ways. This looks like being indebted to men. You have to have a certain place in society, which justifies men when they take action to keep you in those positions by actively, for example, making it difficult for you to make money or hit you when you are refusing to become a mother of their children. When the movement as a whole supports this, it becomes much harder to call out acts of sexism because of its origins go unquestioned. Even when it doesn't actively put you in harm's way, relying on benevolent sexism puts you in a position of subservience to men, which you would regret coming from closing government. Thanks.
All right, I thank the member of government for that speech. To open the last house, I call the member of opposition. Here.
Your eyes in the chat, please. Feminism is attacked on all fronts, but the most necessary battle is within the movement. We think that our allies are key to winning the movement because numbers is crucial in mobilization and gathering strength and eventually getting all the things that we need. Realize that the objects of combating benevolent feminist sexism on opening are not only men or moderates like opening made it seem to be, but will elevate this debate talking about women. Because realize that women are not monoliths. Some are very vulnerable women who highly benefit from benevolent feminist sexism. It's not true that it is the only privileged women who benefit from benevolent sexism. We think it is also minority mothers, full-time caretakers, or even women who earn their jobs because of their feminine characteristics, who because men inculcated that they should, inculcated in themselves that they should take pride in their motherhood and therefore get so much support from the men in their life who feel strongly about protecting them. But also, these are not just conservative women, but also women in progressive spaces. These are emotional women who get romanticized because of their emotions, like Jacinda Ardern, who is an emotionally sensitive woman who therefore is seen as a strong PM because she's caring about her citizens, or Leni Robredo, who is seen as a more rational choice because she is caring, because she is motherly and there to protect the women or people in their country. Then, the similar case of OG and CG is that, the problem of this is benevolent sexism will become a dominant narrative in the long run. I don't see how that's bad, because in the event that in the long term it does become the dominant narrative, it's easier to change that narrative because at that point women will have more power to combat it. I don't get how that's a big of a harm. All of my rebuttals be integrated. I want to talk about how we can use benevolent sexism to win feminist battles, because in developing countries, or even in these developed countries, feminism is seen as too radical. There are women or groups of people who see feminism being a sham, because the biggest banners of feminism are intangible things like pronouns or narratives that women are strong, or even the case of benevolent feminism versus hostile feminism. The non-negotiable needs of women are so tangible things like the overall protection and mobility. We think that these are institutional, like the right to enter spaces, the right to have protection in those spaces, and reproductive health, are being able to choose what they can do with their own body. These battles are non-negotiables because these activates women's ability to exist in the world and be respected and therefore fight for other intangible things. Then these fights are now in progress, that in a lot of countries like the US, the abortion bill is in Congress, which means that we are close to winning, but we are not yet that winning. The benevolent feminism, yes, it uses sexist beliefs, but it is used to justify the protection of women. Talk about the obligation to protect women, or idolizing women and romanticizing their feminist features. Most misogynists or sexists are just angry at women, but the approach of benevolent feminism is not anger when women do something against what they want women to do, but when we idolize women as being caretakers, or value what women bring, or value the feminine features that they have. The starting point of these benevolent sexists is always at the point of intrigue or concern, because you idolize women, you always start with empathy. You always start to question, how can I help women? Then this is parallel in how when our own friends make hard decisions, we don't get angry at them because we don't understand their decisions, but because we respect them, we start with empathy. Realize that for the most vulnerable women, we think that these are women who get protected by those benevolent sexists, that because their emotions are seen as a source of strength, that is, we call you in times of our conflict because you are the woman who understands us the most. We think men value us because of what we can bring to the family, because of our emotions. We think that there are women who gain privilege from it, especially minority women who probably have children, who probably need to get jobs, who probably need to bank on their feminine characteristics to get the things that they need. Three structural harms of government when we combat these benevolent sexists. Number one, we fail in changing them, because when we combat them and tell them that they're wrong, even no matter how the approach is, we think that it's still telling them that their values are wrong. What happens here is that it takes such a long time to change your beliefs, your understanding. It is therefore hard to understand what you're doing wrong when you feel that you're being better. We think that for women who need this, they're going to think that, I thought the feminist movement is for me, but why are they making me take away what they need? It means that they're not likely going to join us when they tell us to stop supporting these benevolent feminists. But secondly, we divide the attention of the women of the movement, because at worst we make the women angry, because it is these women who feel that you are withdrawing our privileges for us to survive. These are minority mothers who wanted that protection from their from the men in their life who are willing to beat up the people who hurt them. Suddenly they'll see that this movement probably doesn't represent me, or that the movement is fighting for intangible things when I want very real things like protection of my rights. We think therefore that these women are not willing to fight for the movement. side. But the worst case of government is that they can be hijacked by the anti-feminist narrative. Realize that in a lot of these countries, there are a lot of movements that are anti-feminist. These are people who see feminism as too radical. They don't want to help women at all, but also they try to tell that feminism is not for women, who want to make women more conservative. Regardless of how peaceful the conversation is, for men, they'll see that, oh, I'm just doing my role. Why are you attacking me? It makes men more hateful. But for women, we think that these are women who are just trying to get by and survive with the resources that they get from benevolent feminists. They'll think, why are you taking it as sexist? They think that, why are you taking it away from me? These are women who will not fight with us, which means that the feminist movement has less mobilizing power, less voting power, and less rallying power for our non-negotiable rights. But the worst thing is that these are people who will actively counter our non-negotiable rights because they think that these are rights of the feminist movement, that the feminist movement is not actually doing to help women. Then we think on their side, they fail the feminist movement on all fronts. What happens on our side is that we continue fighting for the non-negotiables. When we don't combat benevolent feminism, we allow sexism, we allow women to use it for their privilege. We think feminists can approach them and tell them that this fight is for you. We're not fighting for intangible things. We're not taking the things that you have. We're here to fight for the things that you really need. If this makes the movement stronger, yes, we think that on our side, we have more people fighting for the non-negotiable values of feminism. We have stronger mobs, stronger voices in which governments have to be compelled to listen, or we have a stronger voting power for such bills that it therefore has to be passed. Realize that CG wanted to win on these same things. They wanted to prove that they'll help all women, even trans women, but they never proved on how they protect them by combating benevolent feminism. Yes, the trade-off is on our side that we hierarchize women, but at least we get help from the top down. At least we are united as a voting power. That okay, maybe some of these women will feel that they are in a group with people who don't support them, but at the very least, they're all fighting for the same thing. They're fighting for protection. They're fighting for the right to enter. We think that we are the only team who prove the marginal protection of women. For all those reasons, we're very, very proud to oppose. Thanks.
All right, I thank the MO for that speech and call the final speaker on the golf bench. Golflip, here.
Hi, I'll take POIs in chat. Start in 3, 2, 1. The reality of the benevolent sexism on off bench is that they take one hierarchy and replace it with another. Only Irene points out the obvious. Men aren't going to be benevolent or kind to all women. They're benevolent and kind to the women who conform to their standards. It is precisely for that reason that even in the best case of opposition, where maybe some women are privileged, some women do get into positions of power, they are always in positions of less power than men and are incentivized to put other women down and become the heads of the movement because of that privilege. We care about the women that are left at the bottom of that hierarchy. We say a united front is necessary for that. I want to do 3 things in this speech. The first thing I will do is take out OO, whose case is pinned on a misunderstanding of the conditions that lead to sexist acts. The second thing I want to do is take out CO, that concedes that they're replacing one hierarchy with another, and analyze why that's terrible. And the last thing I want to do is take out my idols in OG and explain why their case is sorely lacking in a couple of critical aspects. Let's first take out OO. The main claim we hear from them is that you need to continue spending all your resources to call out hostile sexism. 2 responses. First, in the vast majority of places where the movement has significant resources, where the motion has any margin, people already know that horrible sexism is horrible. And the reasons Irene gives you demonstrate why even if the feminist movement doesn't dedicate any resources to combating this at all, it's unlikely that these things will become a social norm. This is the POI CJ stole from me as a response, but he doesn't analyze the complete impact of that. That means they're unlikely to openly engage in catcalling, sexual harassment, or domestic abuse. The instances where that happens, and the motion where the context where this motion takes place, is instances where women are in positions that are subservient to men and are dependent on those men for continuous success. The second thing they say from DLO is maybe there's a risk of reversal, like eventually you need to continue fighting this struggle in order to maintain those institutions. I don't think they give you a reason for why that reversal would happen. I would suggest, insofar as we've been fighting for this for like a period of 50 years,
genders. Probably this has already been institutionalized. It's probably already in legislature. It will take a significant amount of power from like men or whoever's anti-feminist to overturn these types of legislation. They don't give me a reason why that's likely to happen. The extension from Irene answers why hostile sexism continues to happen in status quo. It's not that men are openly hostile towards women. It's that women feel a sense of obligation, trust, and uniquely dependence, which puts them in dangerous situations. When your boss gives you that job, when your boyfriend is nice to you, so you feel like you owe him sex, when your husband gives you so much, so you should be willing to stay at home. Crucially, this is why the movement has to call it out, because absent an external actor, there's no way to identify this at the beginning of the cycle and correct that sort of relationship. No, this is beyond opening's mechanism of like some subjective feeling of like dependence on them. It is literally you receiving your power from that man, and once you accept benevolence, like once you become their secretary, once you get into a higher job because you accepted favors initially, which means you have no capacity to turn it down. The other way we beat OO is we do what OG doesn't. That is, we concede that in some instances, benevolent sexism will privilege you. It will benefit women and put them in positions of power. The problem is they don't analyze who receives acts of benevolence. It's obviously not going to be all women. It's the women who are most palatable and the women who are most appealing to men, the women they're willing to be nice to, the women who fit into their standards. There are three crucial impacts we point out from Irene that receives no response from CO. First, divisiveness, winning on both them and CO's grounds of what constitutes a harm. The optimal strategy for women in a world where you're fine with supporting benevolent sexism is to conform to gender norms as much as possible, so you receive as many acts of benevolence as possible when other women aren't able to call you out for it. You don't need to change. This also responds to CO's claim that, well, eventually women, privileged women might lend a hand down and give underprivileged women some level of power. That doesn't work because there's no incentive for them to do that. When the mechanism by which they get into positions of power is conforming to gender roles, there's no reason they would question those very same gender roles. The second thing is it narrows down the range of people who become representative of the movement in women's struggles. This is why you don't get abortion. It's not that women suddenly stop wanting abortion. It's because even if the vast majority of people want it, they're unable to get that represented when the heads of the movement and the people with the most power are the types of people who are benefited by those gender roles, which is why it doesn't happen. The last thing is I'm completely fine with taking the trade-off of center-right men not wanting to support the movement. I'm unclear how many center-right men currently support the movement, and I'm unclear what they're doing towards the movement. Like probably the support is tokenistic at best. I don't understand why it's an impact. That takes out OO. The second thing I want to do is take out CO. The first thing they say is it's fine if benevolent sexism dominates because women will have more power in the future to challenge gender roles. One, no, it's about relative power. The problem with benevolent sexism is while it might allow you to climb the ladder, it never lets you climb the ladder above the boss who gave you the position, above the man who is being benevolent to you. So you don't get the long-term ability to question structures and gender norms because you're always subservient to a man. Secondly, it's about the women who get into power in the first place. If these women are privileged by those gender roles, as I explained in my response to OO, there's no incentive for them to question those very same gender roles. The final thing they say, aside from the stuff about privileged women I've already responded to, is that ultra-conservative women are likely to feel alienated and less likely to participate in the movement. First, I'm unsure if these women are currently participating in the movement. They're probably already alienated by many of the policies the feminist movement wants to clamor for. If you want to set the debate in contexts where women have no other choice but to depend on a man or opt into a family structure, I don't think there's much of a margin. That clearly isn't where the debate takes place. I'll take OO.
Yeah, so the problem is on your side. At the point that you lose moderate men for the mechanisms that you haven't dealt with, that is a world in which the people who can actually create legislative change for you, for example, are lost. In contrast, wanting to solve learned helplessness needs a lot less effort because these are women who already have a tendency towards being willing to acknowledge and listen to the feminist movement.
I don't think you guys demonstrate the comparative. If you continue to combat hostile sexism, for which there's already legislation, you aren't getting any new legislative change. At least in our world, you get the micro interactions of women. Like you get them to be more vigilant of the intentions of men around them. They're able to proactively protect themselves from instances where they might be exposed to sexism or hostile forms of sexism. So we're fine with taking the delta of not getting any legislative change because I'm not sure how that happens in the comparative. Final thing then in OG. OG points out that supporting benevolent sexism denies women agency and leads to internal oppression, I think they fail in three crucial ways that are filled in by Irene. The first thing we point out is why it predominates in the minds of women absent callouts from the movement, which answers OO's push of why we can't just focus on hostile sexism. It's because absent is even people within the movement who have power are the ones that want to push this narrative. The second thing we do is we explain why a lot of the times the second thing we do is we explain why calls from the movement are likely to succeed. And the final thing we do is we take off at their best and assume that some women will be empowered by accepting benevolence and still explain why it's divisive and horrible. For all of those reasons, vote CG.
I thank the government whip and call the final speaker in this round, opposition whip. Here.
Phone, please. Okay. Hi, am I audible?
Yep, loud and clear.
All right. Your eyes through voice, please. Closing opposition is the only side in this debate that gave you tangible benefits to the actual struggles of women. In my speech, I will prove why closing opposition gave you the best benefit in this debate. And with that, I'm going to take down the argument of the same arguments that come from the whole government bench. We heard from opening government that we're unlikely to get men to support policies that matter to us, like abortion, sexual harassment, and maternity leave, because they will see us as weak people that then they should decide for us. This was something shared in the whole bench. They think that benevolent sexism always ultimately equal to men disrespecting women and ultimately not hearing them out. I question the reality of this because those particular issues that they talked about actually highlight men's opportunity to protect women. In abortion, most often the narrative that people flag are things like, we have to protect the baby. But benevolent sexists have more leeway and have an easier time to see this problem in the lens of women because their mandate is ultimately to protect women. In women seeking power, the usual hostile sexist rhetoric that we hear is that women shouldn't be in power because they're emotional. But benevolent sexists romanticize that sensitivity. They look at it as something positive, i.e., a lot of supporters of Cynthia Arden label her as emotionally sensitive that made her good leader. Benevolent sexists looks at this emotional trait as something good and something they ought to support. That means not only confident women are in line for power, which are usually women that take the power because they are seen as closer to men's trait. That means not only them can take the power, also emotional and conventionally soft-spoken women also got the shot too. We increase the opportunity ultimately for these women. In workplace harassment, most hostile sexists do not believe women and call them attention seekers when they call harassment. They said that calling you pretty is not something that should make you uncomfortable. But benevolent sexists see this as an opportunity to protect women, to actually fight for harassment policies, because that's how they actually maximize their protection. If it's true that these men ultimately can't do anything to make sure that they have to protect women, then that means at a point in time that they're trying to help women and women are still trying to ask for help, they'll start to question, hey, maybe I should listen to them because my protection is not working. I have to do more protection. With maternity leave and benefit for mothers, the common narrative is that mothers do not need all these benefits because being a mother is not that hard. And if fathers can go back to work, they should do. But benevolent sexists that idolize women can come out from a place of compassion and understanding that allows them to hear out women and not be hostile against them. We would agree that benevolent sexism is not perfect, but it is a necessary stepping stone to utilize this view to get more buy-in from greater society. CG said that benevolent sexism is so strong and hard to combat and ultimately legitimized by states and institutions. We agree to this. That's why we said that it's likely to fail when you try to combat benevolent sexism. And we said the most strategic action is to ultimately use this as a stepping stone to get better power and then ultimately beating out or combating all types of sexism. Army proved to you that when you force men to see that, hey, the type of feminism that you think is good is actually sexism, you push men to fall to the traps of misogyny when you back them to a corner. Army proves to you that there's not only one narrative that exists in status quo. There are a lot of narratives that surround men and ultimately tell them that you should never fight for anything feminists fight for because these people hate men and they're unlikely to ultimately listen to you. And once you point fingers and tell them that, hey, maybe you're not actually helping us, you're actually harming us, they will see this as an attack to them because these are men who feel like they're the best feminists there is because they have been protecting women. No response from Tobi. We also prove to you that women that subscribe to the things that benevolent sexism stands for are likely to lose support in what MO proved. I would posit that those confident, sexually liberated women will not leave the movement if we deprioritize combating benevolent sexism because they know that the movement is still fighting for things that benefit them. Conversely, women that benefit from benevolent sexism will see this as a direct attack to them and what they stand for. They'll see this as unstrategic and a waste of resources. So not only that you risk pushing men to become anti-feminist, you also risk a lot of women to ultimately go against the movement. Army proves to you that the likelihood of failure is so high, and when you funnel all your resources to fighting benevolent sexism, more than the fact that men become
PYCG.
anti-feminism, a lot of women are also going to leave you. The only response we got from Tobi is that we're probably talking about women that already alienated by the movement. But we're not only talking about conservative women, we're talking about all women that will see your strategy as useless and trivial. Because while you're talking to men and fighting for trivial things, women are left in the curbside while they're fighting for protection, better pay, and better opportunities. They will see the feminist movement as something that does not fight for them anymore because they want to fight for trivial things. I'll take a POI from opening if you guys have. Closing if not.
If you believe that women need to be protected, it means you view them as weak and unable to make choices for themselves, rather than a narrative that lets women empower themselves on their own terms.
Low. Because if you want to protect women, and ultimately the kind of protection that you give to them is not enough, and they continuously ask for help, you as a person that wants to protect them will ultimately want to see this in their lens and think that, hey, if I want to protect them, this is what they're saying that's going to be effective. You have to engage with that. Secondly, we don't care if benevolent sexism becomes dominant. Because at the point that benevolent sexism is dominant, that means hostile sexism is less now. That also means we have already achieved the policies that we need to protect us, i.e. more affirmative action, protection, and power. It is then easier for us to combat all types of sexism afterwards. We can enact curriculums that help men become better, to treat women better, criminalize sexism, or have the great influence to change the deep-rooted culture of patriarchy and misogyny. Why is this better? A, because policies are more sustainable. It's almost impossible to change them, especially where they're put into law. But men's perception can ultimately change. So we cannot just rely on them, especially in status quo, where there's a rise of far right, where people can just say a lot of batshit crazy things about women. Tobi said women can never be above men, which is an assumption in this debate. We prove to you that in status quo, there's already attraction towards seeing women as viable people that should be in position. You strengthen this when you ultimately romanticize their capability to be emotional. Look at how GovBench argued. They assume that combating benevolent sexism will be the answer to all of our problems. No proving why women will suddenly be in power, why they will be protected, and why we ultimately get these opportunities. Because while you're taking years combating benevolent sexism, there's a lot of opportunity cost, a lot of women that you're letting down because you want to fight for trivial things more than using these trivial things to ultimately become your stepping stone in the better protection of women. With all of those reasons, you have to side with me. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much, Opposition Whip. Thanks everyone for the debate. So this is an open round, so the panel will now move
So let's go straight into the verdict and then the explanation behind that verdict. All these splits in this round were incredibly close, and yeah, very good. Speaks for what. So verdict goes as follows. We thought this was an opening house win, with the first going to opening opposition, the second to opening government, the third to closing government, and the fourth to closing opposition. So I'm first going to resolve the opening exchange and why we thought that OO came ahead of OG marginally, and then weigh in the various closing teams too and explain why they placed in this round as such. So firstly, between the opening houses between OG and OO, I think that the case we get from OG is straightforward, explaining that benevolent sexism is in and of itself something that's harmful, involved in the denial of agency of women, imposing preferences on them that they may not necessarily want. It also creates a set of problems that could potentially lead towards hostile sexism as well, insofar as it is like premised on the fact that we do not recognize the value or the opinions of what women want to achieve in this round. The claim from OO then is basically to say two things. The first thing to say is that benevolent sexism is probably different and distinct from hostile sexism in that it directly seeks to protect women, or at least to do good things for women. And I think that both speakers in OO and later down in CO as well explain the ways in which this narrative could be utilized, or ways that women could lean into this narrative to use it to protect themselves, but also to find safe spaces through which they could derive or find protection from the issues or the problems that they face in this world today. So I think that if with regard to this particular clash and the later clashes or the later analysis in the DPM with regard to explaining how this could potentially lead to a discussion down the board, I think the first question to ask is the scale of resources being committed here. So if it is true that both benevolent sexism and hostile sexism is important things that we ought to solve, the OO makes the claim that hostile sexism is probably the greater priority in this round, insofar as it visits like very direct and visceral harms upon women, and therefore it was probably unfair or like not a good thing to commit a lot of resources that the feminist movement had towards solving things like benevolent sexism, even if it's true it was something that was problematic. The counter from OG with regard to the scale of resources being used here is to suggest firstly that they can do both to some extent, like the movement is probably large and diverse and you don't have to commit that much resources here, and that's why the problems of hostile sexism was not going to be that problematic insofar as the feminist movement could still commit some resources to solve those issues out there. Second thing that OG says, even they have to make the trade-off, they were willing to prioritize fixing benevolent sexism because that's often the root cause that led towards a lot of hostile sexism down the road. So in terms of weighing the clash on the amount of resources used, I think that firstly, the OO gives me a lot more reason to believe why the amount of resources firstly that was going to be used was firstly going to be pretty significant by virtue of the word that the motion says, but secondly because of the increased bar required for you to convince people that benevolent sexism is something that is bad, as opposed to like intuitive reasons why hostile sexism is something that's quite fair. And therefore, given the amount of resources that would be committed, would probably come at the cost of the ability to deal with a lot more hostile sexism. The question that becomes, is these resources best spent in this particular place or the other? And the OO gives me two reasons to believe why resources are better spent here. The first reason they explain is basically with regard to the immediacy and the viscerality of the harms. I think that are able to explain why hostile sexism often results in things like domestic violence, for instance, things that directly impact women in a way that is negative. So even if it's true that benevolent sexism results in the loss of agency, hostile sexism is just much worse that needs to be dealt with. In terms of weighing the time frame, especially in response to DPM stuff about this being the root causes and stuff like that, I think that DLO is able to show that the capacity or the immediacy of the harms in this regard of solving these harms in the short term was probably the more important thing that we have to prioritize now. And I think that given these things do exist, I guess to some extent alone, the OG's weighing as to why firstly, the hostile sexism is not going to be that problematic, but secondly, that the tackling or the dealing with benevolent sexism was probably the more important value in this round, was insufficient to weigh out against the direct and visceral harm inflicted upon women there. So even if it's true that OG gets some change in the long term with regards to being able to start discussions about the loss of agency of individuals and men out there, it was unclear as to why this was the more important value than the immediacy of the harms in opening opposition that the OG had to trade off in this round. And that's why in terms of dealing with this problem, the opening up is ahead. The second thing then to weigh in the opening exchange is sort of the likelihood of this change happening in the first place. And I think that all gives us a number of reasons as to why this probably will not happen. The first thing that I say is just generally speaking, it's probably quite hard to convince men, especially those who have been indoctrinated for a long period of time, that they should give up agency in this regard. So you're probably likely to lose the people from the movement. At least if you wanted to keep them, the burden or the bar to influence them and get them to stay in the movement was probably going to be quite high. And for that reason, the amount of support that you would like to get within the movement was going to be reduced as a result of that. Necessarily means that even if it's true that these things lead to a set of benefits, it was likely going to lead to the worsening of the feminist movement's capacity to fight for change in the future. The second is I guess sort of the direct outcome of that is that you would sort of lose support and lose followers. So the center-right men that initially felt it was okay, couldn't understand why they're now being oppressed, would prop up now being removed from the movement or being challenged in this regard, would probably no longer support the movement. And that's why as a whole, the capacity of the movement to push for this particular change was likely to be limited. In terms of the ability to convince people or the movement to convince people to believe that benevolent sexism was something that needed to be changed, I think that all gives enough reason to suggest why, even if the OG tried, they probably wouldn't be able to convince enough people to create significant impact in this round. At best, DPM claims that they create the value of discussion and discursive effect. But again, I think that falls subservient to the initial clash about the time frame weighing here. So with regard to the capacity to achieve positive change, I think that all just gives me more reason to suggest why being more united and being able to let women lean into this particular narrative was probably the more effective way of going out protecting women out there. So that's why OO edges OG. Let's weigh in CG in this round. So I think contrary to what all teams said, is the CG, while some premises are shared, I do think that they have extensions that are new and probably not derivative from opening government. I get two things. The first thing is basically the framing as to why you need to have this step now to prevent this problem from becoming the dominant narrative in this movement. And I think that member gives me quite a number of reasons as to why there probably is not going to be a lot of incentive to challenge these things within the movement. And that's why it's important to have this thing happening for the leaders of this movement to challenge this, to prevent it from becoming a dominant problem. Second thing that CG gives me is the explanation as to why you're probably going to be able to capture a different subset of people within the movement. So talking about trans women, for example, women with confidence, these are people that are non-conformist in nature, and therefore these are people that were likely to be protected, the point where the movement captures and caters towards them as a result. The last thing that CG said, and this probably is quite similar, is just explaining why the source of hostile sexism is probably benevolent sexism. So I don't think that the last line was particularly impactful in terms of weighing the CG above OG in this round. Let's compare the gov bench. Why does OG ultimately still stake it above CG? The first thing to note then is about the premise or the harms of benevolent sexism, things like the loss of agency, things like learned helplessness, things like the prevention of future harms and starting of discussions. I think a lot of these things are grounded sufficiently in opening government already, that I'm not sure the extent to which the CG extends on this particular mechanism, or what the value of the extension is and why it weighs above the OG case in this round. Because I think that the way that CG attempts to weigh their case above OG is sort of explain why they are filling in the mechanistic gaps or the missing links here. Whereas at least the panel felt that to an extent, these gaps either were not significant towards the case failing as a whole, or did not enhance the scale of its impact in a very meaningful way. And that's why the problems that OG talks about still stood in this round. I think that's probably the strongest line of analysis with regard to increasing the dominance or the prevention of these things becoming the dominant problem in this movement. It's probably is again premised on the fact that benevolent sexism is something that's problematic in the first place. So at best, what CG suggests, it could potentially become a problem in the future, but they don't necessarily explain why this sort of increase in the scope of the problem was necessarily more important than the analysis of the initial problem itself comparative to open gov in this debate. The second thing then is just with regard to extending the mechanism here. And I do think that, as Diallo points out, the OG probably is not able to explain why we would get significant change with regard to convincing sufficient number of people out there to be able to change their minds and opt into this policy. And I think that what CG does here is essentially do a stakeholder trade-off to suggest that we probably really need the center-right men in those movements that are the source of this problem, and we trade them off in order to capture other people that currently are not captured within this movement. And while I think this mechanistic extension is interesting, it's unclear the extent to which it creates an impact, because I think that while you are able to explain that the movement is able to reach out those people, I'm not sure the extent to which this creates societal change at the end of the day. So this means that while you're able to protect these people, firstly, in what it leads to in terms of a societal impact or in terms of a benefit for the feminist movement is unclear. But second, needs to be weighed against the stuff in the DPM about like creating discussions and generally promoting awareness as well. And while I do think that the mechanism is like interesting, the value of that mechanism is probably not as like is not significantly greater than the stuff that's already explained in opening government in this round. So for those reasons, CG takes it below OG in this debate. In weighing on the short diagonal, the reason why CG was unable to take it above OO in this round, I think it's for similar reasons that OG could not beat OO. Firstly, with regards to assessing the like solvency or change or the capacity for creating an impact in this round, I think it will just give enough reasons to suggest that the immediacy of the problem, the direct viscerality of those issues is probably something significant that we need to solve. So I think the approach that CG takes in this round to suggest that probably these problems or the issues of benevolent sexism potentially becoming larger in the future was probably the greater harm we should prioritize, did not answer the question as to why it ought to come at the cost of women facing very visceral problems and potentially even being outed or like having less incentive to stay in the movement or the fracturing of the movement right there. So I think in the absence of that particular weighing, I still had to value the immediacy and the viscerality of the problems that O identifies to be greater than the potential problems or the futuristic problems that the CG assesses in this round. The last thing then is that the OO is also able to explain why women could lean on benevolent sexism or like narratives of chivalry, for example, to protect themselves and create better outcomes. And then it's unclear as to why the mechanism in CG creates better like solvent outcomes for women or like for the subset of women that you talk about, such that it was greater or more important than the outcomes that OO talked about in this round. And for that reason, I still felt that the positive change with regard to protective women fell in OO's favor as opposed to CG here. The last thing to weigh in here then is closing opposition. So in terms of weighing on the op bench, which was, I think, probably the relatively clearer comparison for the panel, is to simply say that the extension that comes in closing opposition is probably to say two things. The first is to explain why this was likely to create issues or resistance from anti-feminist groups, but more importantly, extending on the old premise that some people would be pushed out from the movement, such as those center-right men or probably those women that did not understand the nature of this problem, would then likely fall towards anti-feminist groups and then push back against the capacity for the movement to solve those things. But the second thing is to argue the converse and the flip, which is basically to say that when women are, or when like narratives of benevolent sexism exist or what's a good thing, they could probably use that as a way to push for greater policies, push for greater protection for themselves. I think that the most unique, distinct line of extension from CO comes in terms of the impacting or the grounding of this line by explaining how this creates policy change, which while I think that probably is new, in comparing to opening opposition was insufficient to place them above OO. So given that the premise of the argument of benevolent sexism being a way to protect women, allowing women to lean on this narrative to protect themselves, allowing the movement to form a safe space for this movement, it's unclear specifically as to why, firstly, the creation of policies or the actualization of these things was the more important aspect of the argument compared to the stuff in opening opposition. I think both Elo and Diallo does do enough work to explain why utilizing this narrative could be beneficial for women. And I think I required this CEO to explain why materializing policy change was the most important outcome here. I think the best weighing that comes at the end of the op when they say that policy probably lasts forever and legislation lasts forever, which why I think is could be the starting point of the weighing, probably sufficient to put CEO above OO considering the other analysis that presented around. Secondly, with regards to anti-feminist movements or people joining those anti-feminist movements, if I was willing to credit this particular line as a harm with regards to people being pushed out of the movement, then opting into groups that push back against the feminist movement and worsening the capacity of the feminist movement to do work here. I think that this firstly needs to be weighed against the opening opposition argument that this was likely to split the movement and push those people out. So it feels like a majority of the harms of the capacity for the feminist movement to do things or to mobilize and rally basically derives from the fact that they have supporters in the first place. And while I do think that CO adds value with regards to explaining why some of these people probably work contrary to the movement, it was unclear the extent to which this worsened the harm. comparative to what was already proven in opening opposition. And I think to prove like a scale of harm here, there needs to be some incentive analysis as to why they were likely to join those groups and then create this set of harms. So for those reasons, I think CO was not able to place above opening up in this round. In terms of weighing on the closing exchange between CO and CG, I think the reason as to why CO was not able to place above CG in this round is basically on the metric of like engagement. I think CG gives us some reasons as to why the problem is going to be quite significant and some ways in which they could attempt to deal with those problems. So if the CO wanted to, I think that the way that CO tried to counter the CG claims was just to lean on stronger mechanization and create better outcomes for women at the end of the day. If that's true, I think that the value of this argument was unfortunately we could not credit it towards CO since the majority of that stuff came from opening up this round. In terms of assessing the closing exchange then, we needed to hear stronger responses or direct engagement with the material from closing government, either as to why those claims were untrue or to make the direct comparisons as to why it was unlikely to become like dominant in the first place, or even if it was not really going to become a problem. The extent to which the engagement in between CO and CG comes is like Opwip saying that they would trade off these potential problems because they get better protection for women at the end of the day. And I think ultimately the value of that outcome was not one that we could credit towards CO in terms of weighing the value of the case between closing op and closing gov. So that's why CO takes it below CG in this debate. In terms of weighing the CO against the OG in this round, I think that the responses on the gov bench against for similar reasons why, okay, wrapping up way soon. Yep, so similar reasons as to why CO could not be CG. The OG identifies the problem as to why benevolent sexism is going to be very, very problematic and would lead to a set of harm. I so to disprove or to directly engage with those things beyond the stuff that opening up has already talked about in this round with regards to the benevolent sexism being something that could be positive, that could lead towards good outcomes for women at the end of the day. Insofar as the best analysis in CO to suggest that this leads to a stronger policy change, I think that alone was probably not sufficient to, in terms of the value of that argument weighing against this stuff from opening government, given that they were able to explain a lot of the issues with benevolent sexism and why that was particularly problematic. Yeah, okay, I was asked to wrap way up. So generally, that's the reasons as to why stronger engagement were required and material that was new beyond stuff that OO gave in the round were required. So if anyone have questions, you can drop me a text on Facebook or Discord, whatever. Thank you very much for the debate once again, and all the best for the breaks. Although I'm pretty sure everyone in this room is breaking.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, DJ.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, just before all the teams leave, just a reminder for
Thanks,
all
guys.
teams to fill in the feedback for the judge.
Yeah. Thank
And
you.
I hope the panelists have also done so, I hope.